Welcome, dear listener, to another soothing journey into the sleepy, dusty corners of history. I'm so glad you could join me tonight as we explore a particularly dramatic and complex period, the Crusades. As you settle in and make yourself comfortable, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from and what time of day it is for you. Feel free to leave a comment and let me know. And if you enjoy these gentle explorations of the past, designed to inform and relax in equal measure, I invite you to subscribe for more bedtime-friendly content. Don't worry, I'll wait right here while you get yourself situated, perhaps propping up your pillow or taking a sip of something warm and comforting. There's no need to rush. In the meantime, let your mind begin to wander back through the centuries, to a time when the clash of swords and the fervor of faith shaped the course of human events. Picture yourself in medieval Europe, in the waning years of the 11th century. It's a world vastly different from our own, a patchwork of feudal kingdoms and fiefdoms, where the pace of life is dictated by the turning of the seasons and the tolling of church bells. For the vast majority, life is a daily struggle, a ceaseless cycle of toil in the fields, huddling for warmth against the bitter cold, and the ever-present spectre of disease and hunger. But amidst the hardship, there is also a sense of spiritual longing, a deep yearning for meaning and purpose that suffuses every strata of society. In this age of faith, the Church is the beating heart of European civilization, the source of both solace and authority. And it is from the Church that a spark will soon be lit, a spark that will ignite the tinder of religious zeal and set the world ablaze with the fires of holy war. The year is 1095, and in the Grand Cathedral of Clermont, France, Pope Urban II ascends to the pulpit to deliver a sermon that will echo through the ages. With impassioned words, he paints a dire picture: the holy city of Jerusalem, the very site of Christ's passion and resurrection, languishes under the yoke of Muslim rule. The Christian faithful, Urban exhorts, must take up arms to liberate the Holy Land and reclaim it for Christendom. Deus vult! The assembled crowd roars back. God wills it! And so begins one of the most epic and transformative chapters in medieval history, the era of the Crusades. Over the next 2 centuries, wave after wave of Christian warriors will surge out of Europe, braving unimaginable hardships as they battle their way towards Jerusalem. It is a time of legendary heroes and dastardly villains, of clashing armies and Game of Thrones level intrigue, but also of immense human suffering and religious and cultural upheaval. But what was it really like for those who lived through this tumultuous period? What did it mean for a humble peasant to take up the cross and embark on a perilous journey to an unknown land? How did the lordly knights and clerics who led the Crusades grapple with the immense challenges and contradictions of their mission? And how did the Muslim inhabitants of the Holy Land experience this seismic clash of civilizations? These are just some of the questions we'll be exploring tonight as we delve into the complex and often tragic history of the Crusades. So, take a deep breath, let your eyelids grow heavy, and allow yourself to be transported back to a world of chivalry and jihad, of soaring cathedrals and blood-soaked sands. But before we plunge into the heart of our story, let's take a moment to set the stage and examine the deeper currents that gave rise to this world-altering movement. After all, the Crusades didn't emerge from a vacuum. They were the product of centuries of religious, political, and social developments that had been brewing in Europe and the Middle East. To really understand why so many people, from kings and popes to lowly foot soldiers, felt compelled to take up the cross, we need to zoom out and consider the big picture. By the late 11th century, European Christendom was undergoing a profound transformation, one marked by rising populations, advances in agriculture and trade, and a renewed sense of spiritual and intellectual vitality. The Church, long the most powerful institution in medieval society, was asserting its authority like never before, with reformist popes seeking to stamp out corruption and heresy while extending their control over the secular realm. At the same time, the feudal aristocracy was growing increasingly restless, eager for new opportunities to expand their power and prestige through military conquest. Meanwhile, in the Middle East, the once mighty Byzantine Empire, the Christian successor to ancient Rome, found itself beset by external threats and internal divisions. To the east, the rising power of the Seljuk Turks posed an existential challenge, as these fierce Muslim warriors steadily gobbled up Byzantine territory in Anatolia and menaced the empire's heartland. It was against this backdrop of religious ferment, political instability, and simmering cultural tensions that Pope Urban II issued his fateful call to arms in 1095. But what exactly did he say in that momentous sermon at Clermont, and how was his message received by the gathered throngs? According to contemporary accounts, Urban painted a lurid picture of the sufferings of Eastern Christians under Muslim rule, recounting tales of torture, enslavement, and desecration of holy sites. Whether these stories were entirely accurate is beside the point. What mattered was their emotional impact on Urban's audience. With vivid and inflammatory language, the Pope cast the Muslims as savage enemies of Christ, who had to be expelled from the Holy Land by force. At the same time, he held out the promise of spiritual rewards for those who took up the cross, the remission of sins, the assurance of a place in heaven, and the glory of being hailed as a soldier of God. It was a potent mix of religious zeal, martial valor, and eschatological urgency, and it struck a chord with the knights and nobles who heard Urban's words that day. Many of them had grown up steeped in the ethos of chivalry, which prized courage, honor, and piety above all else. For them, the chance to put their martial skills to use in the service of God was an irresistible call. But it wasn't just the elites who were swept up in the fervor of the Crusades. Urban's message also resonated with the common folk of Europe, many of whom saw in the expedition to Jerusalem a chance to escape the grinding poverty and oppression of their daily lives. For these poor pilgrims, the crusade offered a tantalizing glimpse of adventure, spiritual renewal, and perhaps even a better life in the Holy Land. Of course, the realities of the First Crusade would prove far harsher and more disillusioning than most of its participants could have imagined. But in that heady moment at Clermont, as the crowds roared their assent and sewed crosses onto their garments, anything seemed possible. The die had been cast, and Christendom was about to embark on a holy war that would shape the course of history for generations to come. As we'll see, the road to Jerusalem was paved with good intentions and a whole lot of blood, sweat, and tears. The Crusaders would face unimaginable hardships and challenges as they battled their way across thousands of miles of hostile territory, from the blistering deserts of Anatolia to the towering walls of the Holy City itself. Along the way, they would leave an indelible mark on the lands and peoples they encountered, for good and for ill. The Crusades would give rise to new kingdoms, dynasties, and religious orders, while also sowing the seeds of bitter resentment and cultural misunderstanding that would echo down through the centuries. But as we embark on this epic journey into the heart of the medieval world, it's important to remember that the Crusades were fundamentally a human story, one shaped by the dreams, fears, and foibles of countless individuals caught up in the sweep of history. From the lowliest foot soldier to the mightiest sultan, each played their part in this grand and tragic drama. So as you drift off to sleep, dear listener, let your mind wander back to that distant age of faith and fury, when the fate of empires hinged on the clash of swords and the fervor of belief. And as we explore the twists and turns of this incredible story together, remember that even in the darkest and most turbulent of times, the human spirit has always found a way to endure, to adapt, and to hope for a better tomorrow. But for now, let the cares of the modern world fade away and allow yourself to be transported back to the dawn of the Crusades, when a pope's fiery words set the world aflame and changed the course of history forever. There will be plenty of time to unpack the complex legacy of this era in the hours ahead. But first, we must set forth on our journey, one careful step at a time. Our story begins in the bustling ports and pilgrimage routes of Europe, where tens of thousands of men, women, and children are gathering to answer Pope Urban's call. They come from all walks of life, grizzled knights and fresh-faced squires, pious monks and worldly clerics, humble peasants and haughty nobles. Some are driven by genuine religious zeal, while others are more motivated by the promise of adventure, riches, or a chance to start anew in the fabled land of milk and honey. But all are united by a common sense of purpose, a belief that they are embarking on a righteous and necessary mission to reclaim the birthplace of their faith. As they set out on the long and perilous journey eastward, the Crusaders have little inkling of the trials and tribulations that await them. Many are woefully unprepared for the rigors of travel and combat, lacking adequate supplies, training, or leadership. Others are consumed by vainglory and infighting, more interested in settling scores with their fellow Christians than in doing battle with the infidel. Indeed, the so-called People's Crusade that sets out in the spring of 1096 is a ragtag and unruly mob, composed largely of untrained peasants and zealots, led by the charismatic but erratic preacher, Peter the Hermit. Impatient to reach Jerusalem and claim their heavenly reward, they surge ahead of the main Crusader armies, leaving a trail of chaos and carnage in their wake. Their first victims are the Jewish communities of the Rhineland, who become targets of a vicious campaign of forced conversion, expulsion, and outright massacre. Hundreds, if not thousands, are slaughtered in a frenzy of anti-Semitic violence that will leave a lasting stain on the Crusader movement. But the People's Crusade is just a warm-up act for the main event, the arrival of the great lords and knights of Europe, who have spent months mustering their forces and making preparations for the long march to the Holy Land. Led by seasoned warriors like Godfrey of Bouillon, Raymond of Toulouse, and Bohemond of Taranto, these armies are better equipped and disciplined than their peasant counterparts. But they too will face daunting challenges on the road ahead. As the Crusaders make their way across Europe and into Anatolia, they must contend with scorching heat, rugged terrain, and constant harassment from Turkish raiders. Thousands die of thirst, hunger, and disease, while others fall victim to ambushes and skirmishes with the enemy. At times, the journey seems like a waking nightmare, a test of faith and endurance that pushes the Crusaders to the brink of despair. But through sheer grit and determination, and no small amount of brutality and fanaticism, the Crusaders press on, driven by the unshakable conviction that they are doing God's work. When they finally reach the gates of Antioch in the fall of 1097, they are a far cry from the shining knights of legend, battered, bedraggled, and barely clinging to life. Yet even in their weakened state, the Crusaders prove a formidable foe, laying siege to the heavily fortified city with a combination of brute force and cunning strategy. For nearly 8 months, they batter the walls with siege engines and engage in fierce hand-to-hand combat with the Muslim defenders, all while fending off attacks from the surrounding countryside. It is a grueling and bloody affair, one that tests the limits of human endurance and exposes the fault lines within the Crusader camp. Rivalries and resentments simmer beneath the surface as the various lords and factions jockey for power and influence. At times it seems as though the Crusaders are as much at war with each other as they are with the enemy. But in the end, through a combination of perseverance, treachery, and sheer dumb luck, the Crusaders finally breach the walls of Antioch and pour into the city, unleashing a wave of violence and destruction that will live in infamy. Muslims and Christians alike are put to the sword, their blood running in rivers through the streets. It is a scene of unimaginable horror and brutality, a stark reminder of the depths to which men can sink in the name of God and glory. Yet even as the Crusaders revel in their hard-won victory, they find themselves facing a new and even more daunting challenge. For no sooner have they taken Antioch than they are themselves besieged by a massive Muslim army, led by the fearsome Kaboga of Mosul. Outnumbered and cut off from supplies, the Crusaders seem doomed to a slow and agonizing death. But in their darkest hour, they experience what can only be described as a miracle. According to legend, a humble peasant named Peter Bartholomew has a vision in which Saint Andrew reveals to him the location of the Holy Lance, the very spear that pierced the side of Christ on the cross. After much searching and controversy, the lance is unearthed from beneath the altar of the Cathedral of St. Peter, and its discovery electrifies the Crusader camp. Emboldened by this tangible sign of divine favor, the Crusaders rally their flagging spirits and prepare for a desperate last stand. On June 28, 1098, they march out of the city gates to face Kerboga's army. The Holy Lance borne aloft by the papal legate Adhemar of Le Puy. What follows is one of the most remarkable battles in the history of the Crusades, as the outnumbered and exhausted Franks somehow manage to rout the Turks and send them fleeing in disarray. It is a stunning victory, one that cements the Crusaders' grip on Antioch and opens the way for their final push towards Jerusalem. But it also comes at a terrible cost, as disease and hunger continue to ravage the Christian ranks. By the time they set out on the last leg of their journey in the spring of 1099, the Crusaders are a mere shadow of their former selves. A ragged band of survivors driven more by desperation than by faith or chivalry. As they make their way down the coast of Palestine, the Crusaders face one last great obstacle: the heavily fortified city of Jerusalem, the ultimate prize of their long and bloody campaign. For weeks they lay siege to the city, pounding its walls with catapults and battering rams while fending off fierce counterattacks from the Muslim defenders. It is a brutal and unforgiving struggle, one that pushes the Crusaders to the very limits of their endurance. Many are killed or wounded in the fighting, while others succumb to the ravages of thirst and disease. But through sheer grit and determination, the Franks finally breach the walls on July 15th, 1099, and pour into the city in a frenzy of violence and destruction. What follows is one of the darkest chapters in the history of the Crusades, as the victorious Christians unleash a wave of slaughter and pillage that will stain their reputation for generations to come. Muslims and Jews alike are put to the sword, their bodies piled high in the streets, and their blood flowing through the holy places of the city. It is a scene of unimaginable horror and brutality, a stark reminder of the savagery that lurks within the human heart. Yet even in the midst of this orgy of violence, there are moments of transcendent beauty and spiritual ecstasy. As the Crusaders kneel in prayer before the Holy Sepulchre, the tomb of Christ himself, they are overcome with a sense of awe and wonder, a feeling that all their trials and sacrifices have been worth it for this one shining moment of grace. In the aftermath of the conquest, the Crusaders set about establishing their rule over the Holy Land, carving out a patchwork of feudal states that will become known as Outremer, the land beyond the sea. It is a precarious and often chaotic existence, one marked by constant warfare, political intrigue, and cultural clash. For the Muslim inhabitants of the region, the Crusader presence is a bitter pill to swallow, a reminder of their own weakness and humiliation. Many are forced to flee their homes or convert to Christianity under duress, while others live in a state of uneasy coexistence with their new overlords. Yet despite the many challenges and contradictions of Crusader rule, there are also moments of genuine cross-cultural exchange and accommodation. In the bustling ports and markets of the Levant, Franks and Muslims rub shoulders and trade goods, while in the great halls and courtyards of the Crusader castles, knights and ladies mingle with Arab poets and scholars. It is a complex and often confounding world, one in which the lines between friend and foe, sacred and profane. The tides of history had shifted, and the Crusader states found themselves beset on all sides. The once formidable castles that dotted the landscape of the Holy Land now felt more like isolated islands in a rising sea of Muslim resistance. Life in these outposts was a far cry from the glory and riches promised by the early crusading preachers. For the soldiers and settlers who called them home, daily life was a grinding cycle of sweltering heat, meager rations, and the constant threat of enemy attack. But there were still some who clung to the dream that had drawn so many to the east, the chance to carve out a new life, to walk in the footsteps of Christ and his apostles. They were the stubborn ones, the true believers, the ones who refused to relinquish their tenuous grip on this arid patch of sacred ground. One can hardly blame them for their tenacity. After all, Generations of crusaders had sacrificed everything, wealth, status, even their very lives, to wrest these territories from Muslim control. To abandon them now would be to admit the futility of that sacrifice, to concede that it had all been for naught. And so they persevered, these Frankish lords and ladies, knights and priests, artisans and farmers. They woke each morning to the call of the muezzin from the minarets of nearby Muslim villages. They haggled in marketplaces scented with exotic spices and patrolled walls bleached white by the relentless Mediterranean sun. At night, they dozed fitfully beneath the flicker of oil lamps, their dreams haunted by the spectre of the enemy at the gates. It was a precarious existence, to be sure, but also a strangely enchanted one. In the twisting alleyways of Jerusalem and Acre, Tripoli and Tyre, one could hear a babel of languages: French and Italian, Arabic and Greek, Armenian and Syriac. The cultural barriers that had once seemed so rigid began to erode, worn away by the necessities of trade and diplomacy. Crusaders married local Christian women and fathered children who grew up speaking the languages of both East and West. They adopted the flowing robes and pointed helmets of their Muslim adversaries, even as they clung fiercely to their Catholic faith. Hybridized art and architecture flourished, blending European and Islamic influences into something wholly unique. But this fragile cosmopolitanism could not mask the fundamental instability of the Crusader states. The Muslim princes who had been so divided in the early days of the Crusades were beginning to put aside their differences, rallying around charismatic leaders who promised to drive the Franks back into the sea once and for all. Chief among these was Saladin, the Sultan of Egypt and Syria. Born into a prominent Kurdish family, Saladin had risen through the ranks of the Fatimid Caliphate before seizing power in a daring coup. He was a brilliant military strategist and a savvy politician, but above all, he was a devout Muslim who burned with zeal to reclaim Jerusalem for Islam. As Saladin began to consolidate his power, the Crusaders watched with growing unease. They knew all too well that their hold on the Holy Land was only as strong as the disunity of their enemies. With each passing year, that disunity was eroding, and the day of reckoning drew nearer. For now, though, life in the Crusader states carried on much as it always had. The nobles schemed and squabbled, jockeying for influence in the royal courts of Jerusalem and Cyprus. The military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, the Teutonic Knights, trained relentlessly for the battles to come, even as they tended to the sick and the poor. And the common people, the shopkeepers and craftsmen, the farmers and herdsmen, simply tried to eke out a living in this harsh and unforgiving land. They married and gave birth, celebrated feasts, and mourned losses, all the while knowing that everything they had built could be swept away in an instant by the vagaries of politics or the tides of war. It was a strange and paradoxical existence, poised between the sacred and the profane, the earthly and the eternal. In the Crusader states, one could attend Mass in the morning, haggle over silks and spices in the afternoon, and stand guard on the ramparts all through the night, peering into the darkness for any sign of the enemy's approach. Perhaps that is why, even now, centuries after the last Frankish foothold crumbled into the sea, the Crusader era continues to exert such a powerful hold on our imaginations. It was a time of great cruelty and great courage, of pious devotion and base avarice, of clashing civilizations and surprising moments of cross-cultural exchange. For all its violence and brutality, there is something strangely compelling about this chapter in human history. A sense that, in the clash of Crusaders and Saracens, something fundamental was being worked out about the relationship between East and West, Christianity and Islam, the Old World Order and the New. Of course, for those who actually lived through the Crusades, such lofty considerations were likely far from their minds. They were too busy trying to survive, to coax a meager harvest from the stony soil, to fend off disease and hunger, to keep their swords sharp and their faith unshakable in the face of an implacable foe. It was a hard life, a brutal life, a life that demanded everything of those who chose to embrace it. And yet, for all that, it was also a life shot through with moments of transcendence. The soaring beauty of a Gothic cathedral, the rush of adrenaline in the heat of battle, the quiet satisfaction of a prayer uttered in the hush of a candlelit chapel. These were the paradoxes that defined life in the Crusader states. The way that the sacred and the profane, the sublime and the squalid, seemed to exist side by side, inextricably intertwined. It was a world of stark contrasts and uneasy compromises, where the lofty ideals of the Crusades constantly bumped up against the messy realities of human nature. As Saladin's power grew and the Muslim world began to unite against the Crusaders, these paradoxes would be thrown into ever sharper relief. The final reckoning was coming, and the Franks of Outremer would soon be forced to confront the ultimate test of their faith and their fortitude. But that is a story for another time. For now we leave them here, these crusaders and settlers, these men and women who risked everything to carve out a new life in the shadow of the cross and the crescent. They were a flawed and fallible lot, to be sure, driven by greed and ambition as much as by piety and zeal. And yet, there is something strangely admirable about their tenacity, their stubborn refusal to surrender the dream that had drawn them to this far-off corner of the world. In a time of great upheaval and uncertainty, they clung to their faith and their sense of purpose, with a grim determination that even now, centuries later, commands a certain grudging respect. So let us pause for a moment to remember them. The knights and the ladies, the priests and the pilgrims, the farmers and the artisans who lived and loved and fought and died beneath the blazing sun of the Holy Land. Theirs was a world very different from our own, and yet in their struggles and their sacrifices, their triumphs and their failures, we may just catch a fleeting glimpse of our common humanity. As Richard the Lionheart's forces sailed across the Mediterranean, they must have felt a profound mix of anticipation and dread. The journey itself was an immense undertaking. Supplying a Crusader army was a logistical nightmare. Food and water had to last for months at sea. Horses were crammed into the holds of ships, standing in their own filth. Many animals died in transit, and a sizable number of men, too, succumbing to disease or malnutrition before they even reached the shores of the Holy Land. Those who survived the voyage then had to march through scorching deserts and rugged mountains to reach their objectives. The armored knights, well equipped as they were, must have baked inside their mail and padding under the relentless Near Eastern sun. At times, it would have felt more like a death march than a holy war. Along the way, they skirmished with Saladin's swift-moving forces. The Sultan's mounted archers would dash close, let fly a volley of arrows, and then slip away before the knights could mount a proper charge. It was a frustrating and demoralizing form of combat for the Crusaders, who were used to meeting their foes head-on in brave clashes of horse and steel. But Richard was a cunning commander, and he adapted his tactics to the unfamiliar terrain. At the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, he masterfully timed a sudden charge of his knights to scatter and destroy the harassing enemy cavalry. Stunned by the speed and ferocity of the unexpected attack, Saladin's men were put to flight, leaving Richard in possession of the field and the road northward to Jaffa. The Lionheart pressed on, retaking key Crusader strongholds along the Palestinian coast. His disciplined troops and tactical brilliance brought him to within striking distance of Jerusalem itself. But dwindling supplies, mounting casualties, and discontent within his war-weary army eventually convinced Richard that the city was, for the moment, unattainable. With winter approaching and his men yearning to return home, he grudgingly agreed to a 3-year truce with Saladin. It was a bitter pill for the proud king to swallow. Though he'd scored numerous battlefield victories and restored the Kingdom of Jerusalem as a viable entity, Richard's crusade ended without achieving its ultimate goal. The holiest city in Christendom remained tantalizingly out of reach. As he sailed back to Europe, Richard must have brooded on the inconclusive outcome of his efforts. Despite all the blood spilled and treasure spent, the fundamental situation in the Holy Land remained unchanged. The Kingdom of Jerusalem still clung to a precarious existence, surrounded by a united Muslim front under a formidable leader. In a sense, Richard's crusade marked the beginning of the end for the Crusader states. While they would linger for another century, their grip on the Levant was increasingly shaky. Muslim rulers like the Mamluks of Egypt systematically chipped away at Crusader holdings, and no major European crusades arrived to shore them up. Enthusiasm for the distant, costly wars waned as the political situation in Europe grew more complex. For the inhabitants of the Crusader states, this was an ever-present source of anxiety. They lived their lives under a cloud of existential dread, knowing that their Christian redoubts could, at any moment, be overwhelmed by the Muslim forces that surrounded them. The looming specter of siege, starvation, and slaughter was a constant psychological burden. It's difficult for us to imagine that level of stress and uncertainty. The nearest modern parallel might be living in West Berlin during the tensest years of the Cold War, with the Red Army perched just outside the city limits. But even that doesn't quite capture the totality of the threat the Crusaders faced, or the grim fate that awaited them if their defenses failed. In this pressure cooker environment, the Franks of Outremer developed a unique hybrid culture. They adopted local customs and garb, becoming over time almost unrecognizable to their Western European cousins. Intermarriage between Crusaders and natives was not uncommon, giving rise to a new generation that straddled both worlds. But this cultural fluidity didn't necessarily translate into peaceful coexistence. The fundamental purpose of the Crusader states was, after all, to maintain Christian control over Muslim lands. This objective, and the bloody wars waged in pursuit of it, bred lasting resentment among the subjugated populations. Cooperation was always tenuous and provisional. The military orders like the Knights Templar and Knights Hospitaller embodied this tension. Formed to protect Christian pilgrims and fight the enemies of the faith, they combined monastic piety with a fierce warrior ethos. In many ways, they were the hardened tip of the Crusader spear, the most implacable foes of Islam. But living in constant readiness for war took a heavy toll, even on these dedicated knights. The Templars and Hospitallers lived according to strict rules, their days regimented by prayer and training. They were forbidden to marry or own property, their entire lives devoted to the defense of the Holy Land. It was a harsh and Spartan existence, one that left little room for levity or leisure. And yet, for all their asceticism, the military orders grew rich and powerful. Showered with donations and bequests from pious Europeans, they amassed vast landholdings and became involved in finance and trade. This wealth allowed them to construct formidable castles and fortresses, like the Templar stronghold of Tortosa or the Hospitaller castle Crac des Chevaliers. These imposing edifices served as the nerve centers of the Crusader states, the anchor points from which Frankish power projected into the surrounding countryside. But they were also stark reminders of the Latin East's inherent fragility. No matter how thick the walls or how valiant the defenders, they were always, in the end, isolated islands in a Muslim sea. This sense of precarity, of living constantly on a knife's edge, suffused every aspect of existence in Outremer. It was there in the hushed prayers of the monks and nuns, pleading for God's protection. It was there in the clipped banter of the knights as they patrolled the pilgrim roads, eyes always scanning the horizon for danger. It was there in the furtive glances and guarded whispers of the native Christians and Muslims who lived under Crusader rule, never quite sure where they stood or what the future might bring. Over time, this ambient anxiety wove itself into the very fabric of the Crusader states. It shaped their culture, their politics, their religion, a constant thrumming undertone that colored every interaction and decision. And it never really went away, even in moments of relative peace and stability. The knowledge that it could all come crashing down at any instant was always there, lurking in the back of every mind. This, perhaps more than anything else, is what made life in the Latin East so psychologically harrowing. It wasn't just the physical dangers. The battles, the sieges, the diseases. It was the unrelenting mental stress, the low-grade dread that seeped into every waking moment. It was the bone-deep understanding that everything you knew, everyone you loved, could be ripped away in an eye blink by forces beyond your control. For the Crusaders and their descendants, that realization must have been a constant weight, pressing down on their shoulders as they went about their daily lives. It's a feeling that's hard for us to fully grasp from the comfort and security of the modern world. But try to imagine it, that gnawing, ever-present fear, the sense that the sword of Damocles is always dangling just above your head. Now picture living with that feeling for years, even decades. Picture waking up with it every morning, going to bed with it every night. Picture trying to build a life, to raise a family, to find some scrap of joy and meaning, all while knowing that the thread could snap at any moment and bring it all tumbling down. That was the reality for the denizens of Outremer. That was the psychological toll of living on the perpetual front lines of a holy war. And it's a big part of what made life in the Crusader states so profoundly challenging, so utterly exhausting, in a way that's difficult to fully appreciate from the distance of centuries. As we sift through the grand sweep of events, the battles, the treaties, the shifting tides of history, it's easy to lose sight of this human dimension, the day-to-day lived experience of the people who called these embattled realms home. But it's a crucial part of the story, and one that deserves to be remembered and reckoned with. Because in the end, that's what history is really about. Not just the marquee names and momentous dates, but the ordinary men and women who lived and struggled and died in times so very different from our own. To fully understand the past, we have to try to see through their eyes, to feel the world as they felt it. And when we do that, when we really try to immerse ourselves in the reality of life during the Crusades, one thing becomes abundantly clear. It sucked. It sucked in ways that are hard for us to even conceive of, let alone endure. But endure they did, for generations, in the face of challenges that would break most of us. They built lives and forged identities in the crucible of constant conflict, carving out a tenuous existence between the hammer of the West and the anvil of the East. Their story is one of resilience in the face of unrelenting adversity. It's a testament to the human capacity to adapt, to persist, to find some way to carry on even in the most trying of circumstances. And while we may not envy them their lot, we can certainly marvel at their fortitude. So as we lay back and let our minds drift, as we ponder the twists and turns of this turbulent chapter in human history, let's spare a thought for the individuals who lived it. For the Crusader knights and the Muslim warriors, for the pilgrims and the peasants, for all those caught up in the tides of holy war. Their lives were hard in ways that are difficult for us to grasp. They were shaped by forces beyond their control, buffeted by the winds of religious fervor and political ambition. But they were also marked by moments of grace and humanity, by the small triumphs and quiet joys that make even the darkest times bearable. As we drift off to sleep, let's hold those moments in our thoughts. Let's remember that even in the midst of the most tumultuous periods, there are always glimmers of light, always reasons to hope and to carry on. That's the lesson of the Crusades, and it's one that still resonates down through the centuries. So close your eyes and let the distant past wash over you. Imagine the clanking of armor and the thunder of hooves, the murmur of prayers and the clash of swords. But imagine too the laughter of children at play, the comfort of a warm hearth on a cold night, the simple joy of a hard-earned moment's rest. These are the threads that make up the tapestry of human experience in all its rich and complicated hues. And as we surrender to sleep's embrace, we can take solace in the knowledge that, no matter how dark the night or how uncertain the dawn, those threads endure, weaving us all into the endless, ever-unfolding story of our shared past. The Crusades left a complex and bloody legacy that echoes through the centuries to our modern day. The clash of religions, cultures, and empires that played out in the Holy Land forever reshaped the medieval world and beyond. But while knights and kings waged their epic battles, it was the common people who bore the brunt of the suffering and hardship. Life in the Crusader states, established by the conquering Christian armies, was tenuous and fraught with danger. After the brutal sacking of Jerusalem in 1099, where Crusaders massacred much of the city's Muslim and Jewish population, an uneasy coexistence developed between the newly arrived European invaders and the local inhabitants. The Crusaders established four main states: the County of Edessa, the Principality of Antioch, the County of Tripoli, and most importantly, the Kingdom of Jerusalem. These outposts of Latin Christendom clung to the eastern edge of the Mediterranean, surrounded by often hostile Muslim powers. For the Crusaders who settled in these lands, life was a constant struggle marked by warfare, political intrigue, and the ever-present specter of death and disease. Many had embarked on the crusade with lofty dreams of religious glory, or hopes of carving out new lands and titles for themselves in the East. The reality proved far harsher than the fantasy. The early Crusader states were a hodgepodge of feudal fiefdoms loosely united under the authority of the ruler of Jerusalem. In the early days, that title fell to the noblemen who had played a leading role in the First Crusade, starting with Godfrey of Bouillon, who took the humble title Defender of the Holy Sepulchre rather than king. After his death in 1100, his brother Baldwin of Boulogne succeeded him, shedding that pretense and crowning himself King Baldwin I of Jerusalem. Under Baldwin and subsequent kings, the Latin Kingdom of Jerusalem slowly expanded and solidified its grip on the surrounding territories of Palestine. The port city of Acre became the kingdom's key lifeline to Europe, through which a steady trickle of new crusaders, pilgrims, and supplies helped sustain the fledgling state. Despite these reinforcements, the Crusaders were always a minority in the lands they ruled, heavily outnumbered by the native Muslim, Jewish, and Eastern Christian populations. Out of necessity, a system of uneasy coexistence and compromise developed, with the Crusaders relying on local manpower and know-how to maintain their kingdoms. It was a cultural melting pot, but one often marked by simmering resentments, misunderstandings, and the constant threat of violence bubbling over. For the knights and nobles who formed the backbone of the Crusader kingdoms, life revolved around martial pursuits. Frequent skirmishes and clashes with neighboring Muslim powers were a fact of life, with the heavily armored mounted knights of the Crusaders often proving a formidable force on the battlefield. When not fighting, these warrior elites whiled away their days in the grand Crusader castles dotting the landscape, practicing their combat skills, hunting, feasting, and politicking amongst themselves. It was a closed society, still steeped in the feudal traditions of Europe, where noble birth and prowess at arms counted for everything. Towering figures like Baldwin II, who ruled Jerusalem from 1118 to 1131, embodied the martial spirit of the Crusader nobility. A veteran of the First Crusade, Baldwin spent much of his reign locked in constant struggle against the kingdom's Muslim neighbors, clashing with the Seljuk Turks and the Fatimids of Egypt. His capture by the Turks in 1123 threw the kingdom into crisis, and he languished in their prisons for a year before his release was secured through the payment of a hefty ransom. It was a reminder of the precarious position of the Crusader states, perched on a knife edge of survival at the mercy of the shifting power dynamics of the region. The kingdom relied on a network of imposing castles and fortified cities to defend its borders and maintain its grip on the territory. The most famous of these was Crac des Chevaliers, a massive hilltop fortress in Syria that served as the headquarters of the Knights Hospitaller military order. Rising from the surrounding plain like a great stone sentinel, Crac des Chevaliers was a symbol of Crusader might and a bastion against the kingdom's enemies. Its towering walls and labyrinthine defenses could house a garrison of up to 2,000 men, with storerooms and cisterns designed to withstand long sieges. Life within the castle was Spartan and martial, the days marked by drills, patrols, and preparation for the near-constant fighting. For the rank-and-file soldiers and the common people living under Crusader rule, day-to-day survival was even more precarious. The region was prone to drought and famine, and the shifting front lines of the conflict often devastated crops and livestock. Disease was another ever-present killer, with outbreaks of dysentery, typhoid, and other ailments regularly sweeping through the crowded cities and military camps. Despite the hardships, the Crusader states clung on and even prospered for a time. The key port cities of Acre, Tyre, and Jaffa thrummed with commercial activity, serving as trade hubs between Europe and the Eastern markets. Italian merchant republics like Genoa and Venice established a lucrative presence, and grand churches and palaces sprang up alongside the mosques and synagogues of the local populations. It was a fragile equilibrium, though, forever threatened by the spectre of renewed warfare. That danger crystallized in the form of Saladin, the Kurdish Muslim ruler who rose to power in Egypt and Syria in the 1270s. A brilliant military leader and a savvy politician, Saladin united the fractious Muslim powers under his banner and set his sights on the Crusader kingdoms. The stage was set for a titanic clash of arms and faiths that would shake the foundations of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. For the common people caught in the middle, it promised only a renewal of the suffering, hardship, and death that had marked the Crusades from the very start. The dream of Jerusalem, that shining city on a hill that had drawn so many to the eastward march, remained as elusive and blood-stained as ever. As the 13th century dawned, the Crusader states were in a precarious position. The Muslim world, once divided and fractured, was increasingly united under powerful leaders like the Ayyubid Sultan al-Adil. The Kingdom of Jerusalem, the beating heart of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land, was reduced to a narrow strip along the Mediterranean coast. Its capital, the holy city of Jerusalem, had been lost to Saladin's forces decades prior and remained firmly in Muslim hands. For the Europeans living in Outremer, life was a constant struggle. The Crusader states were surrounded by hostile enemies, with the ever-present threat of invasion and conquest looming on the horizon. The castles and fortified cities that dotted the landscape were not just symbols of Crusader power, but vital strongholds in the fight for survival. Inside their walls, daily life was shaped by the realities of being a small Christian minority in a predominantly Muslim region. The Crusaders themselves were a diverse lot, hailing from across Europe, from the Norman knights of England and France to the Germanic warriors of the Holy Roman Empire. They were united by their faith and their commitment to defending the Holy Land, but divisions simmered beneath the surface. Rivalries between different Crusader factions, between the military orders like the Templars and Hospitallers, and between the Crusader states themselves, all threatened to undermine their common cause. For the average person living in a Crusader city like Acre or Tyre, life was a mix of the familiar and the exotic. The narrow streets were lined with a mix of European-style churches and shops, alongside Middle Eastern bazaars and mosques. The sounds of church bells mingled with the Muslim call to prayer, while the scent of spices and incense filled the air. It was a vibrant cultural melting pot, but one always simmering with tension and the potential for conflict. Beyond the city walls, the countryside was a patchwork of fortified villages and manors, where Crusader lords oversaw the farming of wheat, barley, and other crops. Pilgrims from Europe, making the long and perilous journey to the Holy Land, were a common sight on the roads. So too were heavily armed bands of Crusader knights, patrolling the borders and prepared for battle at a moment's notice. Despite the ever-present danger, there were moments of uneasy peace and even cooperation between the Crusaders and their Muslim neighbors. Trade flowed between the cities of Outremer and the great metropolises of the Muslim world, like Cairo and Damascus. Crusader lords sometimes formed alliances with Muslim rulers against common enemies. There were even instances of cultural exchange, with European scholars studying Arabic texts and Muslim artisans crafting goods for Crusader patrons. But such moments of détente were fleeting. The fundamental reality was that the Crusaders were foreign invaders occupying Muslim lands, and the resentment and hostility this generated was never far from the surface. As the 13th century progressed, that simmering tension would boil over into renewed conflict, a struggle that would ultimately seal the fate of the Crusader states. For the Europeans who had made Outremer their home, the looming end of the Crusader era would be a time of great upheaval and uncertainty. Many would flee back to Europe, abandoning the castles and cities they had called home for generations. Others would make the fateful decision to stay, facing an uncertain future under Muslim rule. But for all of them, the experience of living on the front lines of the Crusades would leave an indelible mark, a legacy that would shape the course of history long after the last Crusader kingdom fell. As the 13th century wound on, the Crusader states were caught between the hammer of the Mamluks and the anvil of the Mongols. The Mamluks were a formidable new power in the Muslim world, a caste of slave soldiers who had seized control of Egypt and Syria. They were fiercely devoted to Islam and saw the Crusaders as an affront to their faith that had to be expunged. The Mongols, meanwhile, were a terrifying new threat from the east. These nomadic warriors, united under Genghis Khan and his successors, had carved out the largest contiguous empire the world had ever seen, stretching from Korea to Hungary. In the 1250s, they smashed into the Middle East, sacking Baghdad and threatening to overrun the entire region. Caught between these two juggernauts, the Crusader states faced an existential crisis. The Mongols were seen by some as potential allies against the Muslims, a force that could break the power of Islam and restore Christian control of the Holy Land. Envoys were sent to the Mongol court, and there was even talk of an alliance. But the Mongols were fickle friends. They were just as happy to sack Christian cities as Muslim ones, and their ultimate loyalty was to their own empire, not the cause of the Crusades. In the end, the Mongols would retreat back to Persia, leaving the Crusaders to face the Mamluks alone. The fall of the Crusader states was a slow but inexorable process. One by one, the great castles and cities fell to the Mamluks. The city of Antioch, once a bastion of Crusader power, was captured in 1268. The mighty Crac des Chevaliers, the headquarters of the Knights Hospitaller, fell in 1271. Acre, the last major Crusader stronghold, held out until 1291, but its fall marked the effective end of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land. For the people living in these final days of the Crusader states, it was a time of desperation and despair. The once proud Crusader knights were reduced to ragged bands, clinging to their last strongholds. The great castles that had seemed so impregnable were now death traps, cut off and surrounded by enemy forces. As the Mamluks closed in, there were scenes of chaos and panic. Crowds of desperate civilians sought refuge within the city walls, while the remaining Crusader defenders prepared for the final onslaught. In Acre, as the Mamluks breached the walls, there was a mad scramble to escape by sea. Ships were crammed with refugees, while others drowned trying to swim to safety. For those who couldn't escape, the fall of the cities meant slavery or death. The Mamluks were not known for their mercy, and they saw the Crusaders as an enemy to be utterly destroyed. In the aftermath of each conquest, there were mass executions and enslavements. The once thriving Christian communities of the Levant were decimated, never to recover. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of an era. For nearly 2 centuries, the Crusader states had been a fixture of the Middle Eastern landscape, a European foothold in the heart of the Muslim world. Their fall was a seismic event, one that reshaped the political and religious map of the region. But while the Crusader era had ended, its legacy would endure. The memory of the Crusades would continue to shape relations between the Christian West and the Muslim world for centuries to come. It would be invoked by later generations, from the Ottoman sultans to modern-day jihadists, as a symbol of the eternal struggle between Islam and Christendom. For the people who lived through the Crusades, however, it was not a matter of grand historical narratives or religious symbolism. It was a matter of life and death, of trying to survive in a world torn apart by war and religious strife. It was a world where violence and brutality were everyday realities, where the line between friend and enemy was always shifting, and where the promise of eternal salvation was the only comfort in a life of constant danger and hardship. In the end, perhaps that is the most enduring legacy of the Crusades, not the grand castles or the epic battles, but the human stories of those caught up in the maelstrom, the stories of the knights and foot soldiers, the merchants and peasants, the men and women who lived and died on the front lines of this centuries-long clash of civilizations. Their voices may be lost to history, but their struggles, their triumphs and tragedies, still resonate down through the ages. They remind us of the human cost of war and the enduring power of faith, even in the darkest of times. And they stand as a testament to the resilience of the human spirit, even in a world where life was often, as Hobbes would later put it, nasty, brutish, and short. As we look back on the Crusades from the vantage point of the modern world, it's easy to see them as a stark reminder of just how much it sucked to live in the Middle Ages. But perhaps they also offer a lesson for our own time, a reminder that even in the face of seemingly insurmountable odds, humanity has always found a way to endure, to adapt, and to hope for a better tomorrow. And with that, we come to the end of our journey through one of the most turbulent and dramatic chapters in human history. The Crusades may be long over, but their echoes continue to reverberate through our world today. They stand as a testament to the power of faith and the folly of war, and as a reminder of the indomitable spirit of the men and women who lived through them. So the next time you find yourself complaining about the inconveniences of modern life, just remember, at least you're not trying to survive in a medieval Crusader castle, waiting for the Mamluks to come knocking at your gate. And with that comforting thought, dear listener, I bid you good night. May your dreams be filled not with the clash of swords and the thunder of siege engines, but with the simple joys and comforts of the modern world. Until next time, this is your humble history host, signing off. The Third Crusade was a titanic clash of egos, religions, and cultures that would shape the future of the Holy Land for generations. At the heart of this epic struggle were two legendary figures: Richard the Lionheart, the newly crowned King of England, and Saladin, the formidable Muslim leader who had united the Islamic world against the Crusaders. Richard was a true warrior king, renowned for his bravery, tactical brilliance, and fiery temper. He had taken the cross and vowed to recapture Jerusalem from Saladin, no matter the cost. But first, he had to navigate the treacherous politics of the Crusader states. The other leaders, like Philip II of France and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, were wary of Richard's ambition and feared he would use the crusade to expand his own power. As Richard and his forces made their way to the Holy Land, they faced countless challenges and hardships. The journey was long and arduous, with many falling victim to disease, starvation, and skirmishes with hostile forces along the way. But Richard was undaunted. He was determined to prove himself as a leader and fulfill his sacred oath to retake Jerusalem. When Richard finally arrived in the Holy Land in 1191, he found the Crusader states in disarray. The fall of Jerusalem and the disaster at Hattin had shattered morale and left the Crusaders on the defensive. But Richard wasted no time in taking charge. He captured the strategically important city of Acre after a lengthy siege, and ruthlessly executed 2,700 Muslim prisoners when Saladin failed to pay their ransom. It was a brutal act that sent shockwaves through the Muslim world and set the stage for a bitter confrontation with Saladin. Over the next 2 years, Richard and Saladin would engage in a deadly game of cat and mouse, marked by raids, skirmishes, and a few pitched battles. Richard proved himself to be a brilliant tactician, using his cavalry to great effect and scoring victories against numerically superior Muslim forces. His most famous triumph came at the Battle of Arsuf in 1191, where he led a daring charge that broke the Muslim lines and scattered Saladin's army. But despite his military successes, Richard was unable to retake Jerusalem. The city was too well defended, and his own forces were depleted and exhausted. In the end, he was forced to negotiate a truce with Saladin, that allowed Christian pilgrims to visit Jerusalem's holy sites, but left the city itself in Muslim hands. It was a bitter pill for Richard to swallow, but he had little choice. The Third Crusade came to an end in 1992, with both sides claiming victory. Richard had successfully defended the Crusader states and dealt Saladin a serious blow, but he had failed in his ultimate goal of recapturing Jerusalem. Saladin, for his part, had held on to the holy city and forced the Crusaders to acknowledge Muslim control of the region. As Richard sailed back to Europe, he could take pride in his military achievements, but also reflect on the futility of the Crusades. Despite all the blood and treasure that had been expended, the Holy Land remained firmly in Muslim hands. The dream of a Christian Jerusalem had proven to be a mirage, one that would continue to lure European rulers and warriors for generations to come. For those who lived through the Third Crusade, it was a time of incredible hardship, violence, and uncertainty. The clash of religions and cultures had brought out the worst in both sides, with atrocities and acts of brutality committed by all. The common people, as always, bore the brunt of the suffering. They were caught between the ambitions of their rulers and the harsh realities of life in a war-torn land. But amidst all the darkness and despair, there were also moments of hope and humanity, stories of chivalry and honor, of enemies who respected each other's bravery and skill, tales of ordinary people who found ways to coexist and even cooperate despite their differences. These glimmers of light, however fleeting, serve as a reminder that even in the darkest of times, the human spirit can endure. As the dust settled on the Third Crusade, the stage was set for yet another chapter in the long and bloody history of the Crusades. The dream of a Christian Jerusalem still burned brightly in the hearts of European rulers and knights, even as the realities on the ground made it seem ever more distant. In the coming years, new crusades would be launched, each with its own twists and turns, triumphs and tragedies. But one thing remained constant: the incredible hardship and suffering endured by those caught up in these holy wars. For the people of the Holy Land, whether Christian, Muslim, or Jewish, the Crusades were a time of unending chaos and conflict, a time when the whims of distant rulers could upend their lives at any moment. The Fourth Crusade, launched in 1202, would take an even more bizarre and tragic turn than its predecessors. Instead of heading to the Holy Land, the Crusaders would find themselves embroiled in a complex web of political intrigue and betrayal that would lead them to the gates of one of the most glorious cities of the medieval world, Constantinople, the capital of the Byzantine Empire. The story of the Fourth Crusade is one of greed, ambition, and unintended consequences. It all began with the best of intentions, the desire to strike a decisive blow against the Muslim world and recapture Jerusalem once and for all. But as so often happens in the tangled web of history, things did not go according to plan. The Crusaders, led by the charismatic but ruthless Boniface of Montferrat, found themselves deep in debt to the Venetians, who had provided them with ships and supplies for the journey. The Venetians, ever the canny merchants, saw an opportunity to use the Crusaders as a tool to further their own commercial interests. They convinced the Crusaders to help them capture the city of Zara, a Christian stronghold that had rebelled against Venetian rule. This act of aggression against fellow Christians was a shock to many of the Crusaders, who saw it as a betrayal of their sacred vows. But Boniface and the Venetians were just getting started. They soon hatched an even more audacious plan: to use the Crusaders to overthrow the Byzantine emperor and place a puppet ruler on the throne who would be more amenable to Venetian interests. The result was a shocking and unprecedented attack on Constantinople, the greatest city of the Christian world. In April 1204, the Crusaders stormed the city walls and unleashed a wave of violence and destruction that would leave the Byzantine Empire shattered and vulnerable. For 3 days, the city was subjected to a brutal sacking, with churches desecrated, treasures looted, and civilians massacred. The fall of Constantinople sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world. It was an act of betrayal and sacrilege, that would have profound consequences for centuries to come. The Byzantine Empire, once a bulwark against Muslim expansion, was left weakened and divided, easy prey for the Ottoman Turks who would eventually conquer it. For the people of Constantinople, the Fourth Crusade was a nightmare of unimaginable proportions. The city that had stood for 1,000 years as a beacon of civilization and learning was reduced to a smoldering ruin, its people left to pick up the pieces and rebuild their shattered lives. The legacy of the Fourth Crusade is one of shame and infamy, a dark chapter in the history of the medieval world. It stands as a cautionary tale about the dangers of religious fanaticism, political opportunism, and the unintended consequences of war. But even as the embers of Constantinople smoldered, the dream of a Christian Jerusalem still burned brightly in the hearts of European rulers and knights. The Crusades would continue for another century, with new armies marching forth to do battle in the Holy Land. Yet as the years passed, the realities on the ground began to shift. The Muslim world, once divided and vulnerable, was beginning to unite under a new generation of powerful and determined leaders. The rise of the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt would prove to be a turning point in the long struggle for control of the Holy Land. The Mamluks were a formidable military force, made up of highly trained slave soldiers who were fiercely loyal to their rulers. Under the leadership of brilliant commanders like Baibars and Kalawan, they would deal a series of crushing defeats to the Crusaders, slowly but surely pushing them back to the coast. The final nail in the coffin of the Crusader states would come in 1291, with the fall of the city of Acre. This last stronghold of the Crusaders had been under siege for months, its defenders holding out against impossible odds. But in the end, the Mamluk forces proved too strong, and the city fell in a bloody and brutal assault. The fall of Acre marked the end of an era, the final gasp of the Crusader dream in the Holy Land. For nearly 2 centuries, European knights and soldiers had fought and died on the dusty plains and rocky hills of Palestine, driven by a powerful mix of religious zeal and political ambition. But in the end, the realities on the ground had proven too much to overcome. For the people of the Holy Land, both Muslim and Christian, the end of the Crusades brought a measure of relief, a chance to rebuild and heal after generations of conflict and chaos. But the scars of those wars would linger for centuries, shaping the politics and culture of the region in ways that are still felt to this day. As we look back on the Crusades from the distance of centuries, it is easy to see them as a grand and epic struggle, a clash of civilizations that helped to shape the course of history. But for the people who lived through them, for the farmers and merchants, the soldiers and civilians caught up in the maelstrom of war, they were a time of incredible hardship and suffering, a reminder of the cruelty and brutality that humans are capable of inflicting on one another. In the end, perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Crusades is the lesson they teach us about the dangers of religious fanaticism and the futility of trying to impose one's beliefs on others through force of arms. It is a lesson that we would do well to remember, even as the world continues to grapple with the complex and often contentious relationship between faith and politics. For those of us living in the relative comfort and security of the modern world, it can be hard to imagine the daily realities of life during the Crusades. The constant fear of violence, the grinding poverty, the sense of powerlessness in the face of forces beyond one's control. But by trying to understand and empathize with the experiences of those who came before us, we can gain a deeper appreciation for the resilience and courage of the human spirit, even in the darkest of times. So let us remember the Crusades, not just as a grand and sweeping historical narrative, but as a deeply human story, one that speaks to the enduring struggles and triumphs of the human condition. And let us hope that by learning from the mistakes of the past, we can build a future that is more just, more compassionate, and more peaceful for all. Ah yes, the Knights Templar and Hospitaller. Now there's a tale steeped in equal measures intrigue and brutality. These military orders arose out of the fervent religious zeal of the Crusades, dedicated to the noble cause of protecting pilgrims in the Holy Land. But much like a sword forged in holy purpose, their shining ideals would soon be tarnished by the grim realities of war and politics. Founded in the early 12th century, the Knights Templar began as a small group of warrior monks sworn to poverty, chastity, and obedience. Their original task was to escort Christian pilgrims safely through the treacherous roads of Outremer. But as the Crusades raged on and the coffers of Europe opened wide, the Templars found themselves transformed from humble protectors into a formidable military force and an even more formidable financial power. Across the Crusader states, majestic fortresses sprung up bearing the Templar cross, standing as stone sentinels over strategic roads and ports. Within their walls, knight and sergeant alike trained relentlessly in the art of war, honing their skills with sword, lance, and crossbow. On the battlefield, their discipline and ferocity was the stuff of legend, their white surcoats emblazoned with the blood-red cross striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. But it was not just in martial prowess that the Templars excelled. As their wealth and influence grew, so too did their role as financial brokers for the crowned heads of Europe. Pilgrims entrusted their valuables to Templar treasuries, and a letter of credit from a Templar preceptory was as good as gold from London to Jerusalem. Kings and popes alike sought their counsel and their loans. Yet for all their power and prestige, the Templars were not immune to the swirling currents of politics and greed. Rumors of secret rituals and heretical practices began to dog their steps, fueled by envy of their riches and mistrust of their secrecy. And when the tide of the Crusades finally turned, washing away the Crusader kingdoms like so many sandcastles, the Templars found themselves adrift in a world that had little use for holy warriors. The fall of Acre in 1291 sounded the death knell for the Templars' original mission. And less than 2 decades later, the order would meet a grim fate at the hands of a French king hungry for their wealth and a pope eager to assert his authority. Arrested on charges of heresy, blasphemy, and all manner of depravity, scores of Templars faced imprisonment, torture, and death by fire. The Knights Hospitaller, meanwhile, fared somewhat better in the shifting winds of fate. Like their Templar brethren, they began as caregivers, tending to the sick and wounded in the Hospital of St. John in Jerusalem. But they too took up the sword in defense of the Holy Land, earning renown for their bravery and skill at arms. After the fall of Acre, the Hospitallers retreated to the island of Cyprus, then on to the island of Rhodes, where they established a new stronghold and a formidable naval presence. For over 2 centuries, they held sway over the eastern Mediterranean, their galleys patrolling the sea lanes and engaging in daring raids against Ottoman ports. But the inexorable advance of the Ottoman Empire could not be held at bay forever. In 1522, after a 6-month siege, the Hospitallers were forced to surrender Rhodes and withdraw once more, this time to the island of Malta. There they would make their final stand, withstanding a massive Ottoman invasion in the Great Siege of 1565, and cementing their legend as the stalwart defenders of Christendom. Yet, for all their valor and tenacity, the Hospitallers too were a relic of a bygone age. As the fires of the Crusades flickered and faded, so too did the need for soldier monks and holy warriors. The world was changing, with new powers rising and old certainties crumbling. And so we come to the close of our tale, dear listener, with the last embers of the Crusader era fading to ash and memory. For nearly 2 centuries, the dream of a Christian Holy Land had consumed the hearts and minds of Europe, unleashing a maelstrom of religious fervor, political ambition, and human suffering. Tens of thousands had marched off to war, knights and peasants alike, driven by faith, greed, or desperation. Vast sums of gold and blood had been spent, great deeds of valor and atrocity committed. Kingdoms had risen and fallen, fortunes made and lost, lives exalted and cast down. In the end, what are we to make of this tumultuous chapter in human history? There are no easy answers, no neat morals to draw. The Crusades were a mirror of their age, reflecting all the brilliance and darkness of the medieval mind. They were a clash of faiths and cultures, a crucible of change and transformation, a reminder of the heights and depths to which the human spirit can soar and plunge. Perhaps, in the end, their true legacy lies not in the castles and kingdoms they built, but in the stories they left behind. Stories of courage and cowardice, piety and brutality, hope and despair. For as long as we remember and recount these tales, as we have done tonight, the echoes of the Crusades will continue to resound through the ages, whispering to us of a world that was, and of the timeless struggles of the human heart. But for now, dear listener, let us bid farewell to the brave knights and pious pilgrims, the wise sultans and wily emperors, the shining cities and blood-soaked sands of the Crusader era. Let their ghosts rest, and their deeds, both noble and base, fade into the mists of dream and memory. For the candle gutters low, and the night grows deep, and it is time for us to slip softly into the embrace of sleep. May your dreams be sweeter than the bitter truths of history, and may the dawn find you refreshed and ready to face the challenges of a new day. Good night, dear listener, and fare thee well. As the dust settled from the fall of Acre in 1291, the last major stronghold of the Crusader states, it marked the end of an era that had begun nearly 2 centuries earlier with the impassioned call to arms by Pope Urban II. The dream of Christian kingdoms in the Holy Land had finally been extinguished. For the inhabitants of the Crusader states, known as Outremer, or the land beyond the sea, it was a bitter and ignominious end to a way of life that had always been fraught with danger and uncertainty. The final siege of Acre had been a desperate and bloody affair, with the city's defenders holding out for weeks against the overwhelming forces of the Mamluks. When the city's walls were finally breached, the streets ran red with blood as the victorious Mamluks slaughtered the remaining inhabitants. Men, women, and children were put to the sword or sold into slavery, their fates a grim echo of the sacking of Jerusalem by the Crusaders themselves nearly 200 years before. For the Crusaders who managed to escape the carnage and sail away from the smoking ruins of Acre, it must have been a moment of profound despair and disillusionment. The dream of Christendom triumphant in the Holy Land, which had sustained them through countless battles and hardships, had proven to be a chimera. Many must have wondered what it had all been for. The lives lost, the treasure spent, the years of toil and bloodshed. The knights of the great military orders, the Templars and Hospitallers, sailed away to an uncertain future, their once powerful organizations now diminished and rudderless. But while the fall of Acre marked the end of the Crusader era, the impact and legacy of the Crusades would endure for centuries to come. The 200 years of Crusader presence in the Levant had left an indelible mark on the region's culture, society, and politics. The Crusades had begun as a religious war, a holy struggle to wrest control of Jerusalem and the Holy Land from the Muslim infidels. But over time, they had evolved into something far more complex, a clash of civilizations, a struggle for political and economic power, and a catalyst for social and cultural change. On a political level, the Crusades had a profound impact on the balance of power in the medieval world. The rise of the Mamluk Sultanate in Egypt, which had been forged in the crucible of the Crusades, would go on to become one of the most formidable powers in the Islamic world. The Mamluks would not only drive the Crusaders from the Levant, but also halt the advance of the Mongol hordes at the Battle of Ain Jalut in 1260, a victory that would have far-reaching consequences for the future of the Middle East and beyond. In Europe, meanwhile, the Crusades had helped to shape the political and social order in ways that would reverberate for centuries. The rise of powerful monarchies in England and France, for example, was in part a response to the demands of financing and organizing the Crusades. The Crusades had also served to intensify religious fervor and solidify the power of the Catholic Church. The idea of a just war against the enemies of Christendom, first articulated by Pope Urban II, would be invoked time and again in the centuries that followed, from the Reconquista in Spain to the wars of the Reformation. But perhaps the most enduring legacy of the Crusades was the way in which they shaped Western perceptions of the Islamic world. For centuries, the Muslim Saracen would remain a fixture of European literature and art, a shadowy and exotic figure that represented the other against which Christendom defined itself. The Crusades had also brought Europeans into close contact with the sophisticated cultures of the Islamic world, exposing them to new ideas, technologies, and ways of life. The cultural exchange that took place during the Crusader era would have a lasting impact on European art, architecture, science, and philosophy. But for all the ways in which the Crusades shaped the course of history, it is important to remember the human toll of this centuries-long conflict. The Crusades were, above all, a time of incredible violence, suffering, and loss of life. For the common people caught up in the maelstrom of the Crusades, the peasants, the foot soldiers, the inhabitants of the besieged cities, life was often nasty, brutish, and short. Disease, starvation, and warfare were constant threats, and the spectre of death was never far away. Even for those who survived the Crusades, the psychological scars could be profound. Many Crusaders returned home deeply traumatized by what they had seen and experienced, their faith in God and the righteousness of their cause shaken to the core. In the end, perhaps the most enduring lesson of the Crusades is the folly of religious warfare and the dangers of fanaticism and intolerance. The Crusades were a time when people on all sides were all too willing to kill and die for their beliefs, to demonize and dehumanize those who were different from them. It is a lesson that remains all too relevant in our own time, as we continue to grapple with the challenges of religious and cultural differences, the temptations of extremism and violence, and the need for understanding and coexistence in an increasingly interconnected world. As we reflect on the long and complicated history of the Crusades, it is important to remember the human stories at the heart of this epic struggle, the stories of courage and cowardice, of faith and doubt, of love and loss. For all the kings and queens, knights and generals who have come to dominate our popular imagination of the Crusades, it was the ordinary men and women, the farmers and the blacksmiths, the mothers and the children, who bore the brunt of this centuries-long conflict. Their stories may be largely lost to history, but they are no less important for that. They remind us of the human cost of war and of the resilience and endurance of the human spirit in the face of unimaginable adversity. As we ponder the legacy of the Crusades and what they can teach us about our own time, let us remember those whose lives were swept up in the tides of history, and those who suffered and died in the name of causes they may only dimly have understood. Let us remember the fallen knights and foot soldiers, the victims of siege and slaughter, and the countless, nameless dead whose bones still lie beneath the shifting sands of the Levant. And let us honor their memory by striving for a world where religious and cultural differences are celebrated rather than feared, where understanding and empathy triumph over hatred and intolerance, and where the horrors of war are but a distant memory. For in the end, the story of the Crusades is not just a story of battles and kings and religious fervor. It is a story of the human experience in all its complexity and contradiction, a reminder of both the heights to which the human spirit can soar and the depths to which it can descend. It is a story that still resonates with us today, 1,000 years after Pope Urban II's fateful call to arms. And it is a story that will continue to be told and retold as long as there are those who seek to understand the past and shape the future. So let us remember the Crusades, not just as a historical curiosity or a cautionary tale, but as a part of the long and complicated tapestry of human history. Let us learn from their successes and failures, their triumphs and tragedies, and let us carry their lessons with us as we navigate the challenges and opportunities of our own time, ever mindful of the power and the peril of the human spirit. As the Crusaders marched on towards Jerusalem, the harsh realities of medieval warfare began to take their toll. The scorching heat of the sun beat down mercilessly upon the armies as they traversed the arid landscapes of Anatolia and the Levant. Many succumbed to thirst and exhaustion, their bodies littering the side of the dusty roads. Disease ran rampant through the ranks, as crowded and unsanitary conditions allowed illnesses like dysentery and typhoid fever to spread like wildfire. For the nobles and knights, the journey was arduous, but still far more bearable than for the common foot soldiers and camp followers. The wealthy could afford better provisions, hardier mounts, and small luxuries to ease the deprivations of the long trek. But for the impoverished peasants who had answered the Pope's call, the crusade quickly became a living nightmare. They marched on with little more than the clothes on their backs, subsisting on meager rations, and the desperate hope that their suffering would earn them a place in heaven. As the Crusaders pressed on into hostile territory, the looming threat of the Seljuk Turks shadowed their every step. These light cavalry warriors were masters of hit-and-run tactics, striking suddenly and then melting back into the hills. They would harass the Crusaders on the march, pick off stragglers, and then vanish before the knights could mount a counterattack. It was a maddening and demoralizing experience for the European armies, more used to meeting their foes head-on in pitched battle. The siege of Antioch in 1097 would prove to be one of the first great tests of the Crusaders' resolve. Antioch was a massive, heavily fortified city, its towering walls manned by a determined Turkish garrison. The Crusaders settled in for a long and brutal siege, constructing wooden towers and stone-throwing machines to try to breach the city's defenses. As the months dragged on, supplies began to run low, and the armies once again fell victim to starvation and disease. It was here, in the depths of suffering and despair, that the very character of the crusade began to shift. Any illusions of chivalry and pious restraint melted away in the face of gnawing hunger and the ever-present specter of death. Some crusaders, maddened by privation, resorted to the unthinkable: cannibalism. They began to raid the surrounding countryside with a newfound brutality, pillaging and slaughtering Muslim and Christian peasants alike in their desperate need for food and supplies. When Antioch finally fell after a grueling 8-month siege, the Crusaders' vengeance was terrible to behold. They stormed into the city, cutting down everyone in their path, men, women, and children. The streets ran red with blood as the Europeans unleashed the pent-up fury of months of hardship upon the vanquished populace. It was a scene of such unrestrained savagery that it would shock even the battle-hardened Turks and Arabs. For the Europeans, it was both a catharsis and a stain upon their souls, a release of all the fear, rage, and desperation that had built up during the long journey and siege. But it was also a betrayal of the lofty ideals that had ostensibly launched the crusade. A campaign to reclaim the Holy Land in the name of Christ had devolved into a rapacious war of conquest, fueled by the basest of human impulses. As word of the massacre at Antioch spread throughout the Muslim world, it galvanized resistance to the Crusaders. If the Europeans had hoped their brutality would cow their enemies into submission, they were gravely mistaken. Instead, it sowed the seeds of a bitter enmity that would shape the course of the Crusades for generations to come. Any hope for peaceful coexistence between the Crusaders and the Islamic world had been drowned in the blood-soaked streets of Antioch. From the ashes of Antioch, the Crusaders marched on towards their ultimate goal, Jerusalem. Their ranks had been thinned by disease, death, and desertion, but their determination had been tempered in the crucible of suffering. They were no longer wide-eyed pilgrims or glory-seeking adventurers. They were hardened warriors, inured to violence and ready to take their holy city by force. But the road to Jerusalem would be longer and harder than any of them could have imagined. The great city was still hundreds of miles away, through hostile lands controlled by increasingly united and determined Muslim forces. The horrors of Antioch would pale in comparison to the trials that lay ahead, as the First Crusade barreled towards its bloody and fateful conclusion. For the people of the medieval Middle East, Muslim, Christian, and Jew alike, the coming of the Crusaders heralded an age of upheaval and strife that would reshape their world forever. The relative peace and stability of the region, which had flourished under centuries of Islamic rule, was shattered by the arrival of the violent, uncouth foreigners from the West. The Crusaders brought with them not just their swords and their zeal, but also a rigid and uncompromising worldview that left little room for coexistence. To the Europeans, the Muslim Turks and Arabs were little more than infidels, barely human obstacles in the path of their divinely ordained quest. They viewed the sophisticated Islamic civilization of the Middle East through a lens of ignorance and hostility, seeing only a land to be conquered and a people to be subdued. For the Muslims, the Crusaders were a shocking and incomprehensible intrusion into their world. These rough, barbaric men from a backwater continent had suddenly appeared in the heart of the Islamic world, slaughtering and pillaging with a savagery that appalled even the Turks and Arabs, who were no strangers to warfare. The Crusaders' fanatical devotion to their faith and their utter disregard for the lives of non-Christians stood in stark contrast to the relative tolerance and pluralism of Islamic society. In the Crusader states established in the wake of the First Crusade's bloody victories, an uneasy coexistence emerged between the European invaders and the native populations. The Crusaders, always a minority in the lands they had conquered, clung to their isolated castles and cities, surrounded by a hostile countryside. They depended on a tenuous lifeline of supplies and reinforcements from Europe, while trying to maintain their precarious grip on the Holy Land. For the Muslim and Jewish residents of the Crusader states, life under Latin Christian rule was a jarring and often traumatic experience. The Europeans brought with them alien customs, laws, and social hierarchies that overturned centuries of tradition. Muslims and Jews found themselves reduced to second-class status in their own lands, subject to heavy taxation, legal discrimination, and the constant threat of violence from their Crusader overlords. Despite this oppression, the native populations of the Crusader states often found ways to resist, coexist, and even thrive under the new regime. Many Muslims and Jews learned Latin and other European languages, acting as intermediaries between the Crusaders and the local populace. Some even found employment in the Crusader bureaucracy, or as artisans and merchants catering to the needs of the European settlers. But this coexistence was always fragile and fraught with tension. The Crusaders' poor understanding of local customs and Islamic law led to frequent clashes and misunderstandings. The Europeans' sense of superiority and entitlement grated on their Muslim and Jewish subjects, who chafed under foreign rule. And the ever-present threat of renewed warfare between the Crusaders and the surrounding Muslim powers cast a long shadow over daily life. As the decades passed and the Crusader presence in the Holy Land became entrenched, a generation of Europeans grew up who had never known any other home. These poulains, as they were known, were a strange hybrid of East and West, speaking Arabic and Turkish alongside French and Italian, adopting local dress and customs, and even intermarrying with the native population. But despite these adaptations, the poulains remained a foreign ruling class, isolated from the people they governed. They lived in a state of constant vigilance, always aware of the precariousness of their position. The castles and fortified cities of Outremer were not just military strongholds, but also psychological barriers, a way for the Crusaders to shut out the alien world around them and cling to their identity as Latin Christians. For the Muslims of the Near East, the Crusader presence was a constant affront, a reminder of the humiliation of defeat and the loss of some of Islam's holiest sites. As the 12th century progressed, a new generation of Muslim leaders arose who were determined to drive the Europeans back into the sea. Chief among them was the great Kurdish warrior Saladin, who would become the bane of the Crusaders and the architect of their greatest defeat. Saladin's rise to power was a story of rare talent, ambition, and timing. Born into a prominent Kurdish military family, he first made his name in the service of the Fatimid Caliphate in Egypt. As a young soldier, he distinguished himself with his bravery, his skill at arms, and his unwavering dedication to the cause of Islam. In 1169, Saladin was appointed Vizier of Egypt by the Fatimid Caliph, a position that gave him control over the country's vast resources and military might. From this power base, he began to expand his influence, conquering neighboring Muslim states and forging alliances with key leaders. His ultimate goal was nothing less than the unification of the Islamic world under his banner and the expulsion of the Crusaders from the Holy Land. As Saladin extended his control over the Levant, the Crusader states found themselves increasingly encircled and threatened. The great Kurdish leader was a master of both diplomacy and warfare, able to forge coalitions and strike decisive military blows with equal skill. He presented a united Islamic front against the divided and squabbling Crusaders, who were often more preoccupied with their own internal rivalries than the Muslim threat. The stage was set for a showdown between Saladin and the Crusaders, a clash of civilizations that would determine the fate of the Holy Land. For the people living in the Crusader states, it was a time of mounting fear and uncertainty. They watched with growing alarm as Saladin's power grew, knowing that their way of life hung in the balance. In 1187, the long-feared confrontation finally came. Saladin, having consolidated his control over the surrounding Muslim territories, marched his army into the Kingdom of Jerusalem. The Crusaders, led by the overconfident and impetuous King Guy of Lusignan, met him in battle at the Horns of Hattin, a rocky and arid plateau near the Sea of Galilee. It was a disaster for the Crusaders. Saladin, employing masterful tactics and taking advantage of the Crusaders' disarray, won a crushing victory. The Christian army was virtually annihilated, with most of its leaders either killed or captured. King Guy himself was taken prisoner, along with the precious relic of the True Cross, the ultimate symbol of the Crusaders' faith and mission. The impact of the Battle of Hattin was immediate and catastrophic for the Crusader states. With their field army destroyed and their king imprisoned, they were virtually defenseless against Saladin's advancing forces. Over the next few months, the great Kurdish leader systematically besieged and captured nearly every major Crusader stronghold, from the mighty walls of Acre to the impregnable mountain fortress of Kerak. But the greatest prize was still to come: Jerusalem, the holy city that had been the ultimate goal of the Crusades from the very beginning. In October 1187, after a brief siege, Saladin entered Jerusalem in triumph. The city that had been the epicenter of the Crusader presence in the Holy Land for nearly a century was once again in Muslim hands. For the Christian residents of Jerusalem, it was a moment of profound shock and despair. Many fled the city, fearing the vengeance of the victorious Muslims. Others chose to stay, placing themselves at Saladin's mercy. In a remarkable display of magnanimity, especially in light of the savage conduct of the Crusaders when they had taken the city, Saladin spared the lives of Jerusalem's Christian inhabitants. They were allowed to ransom themselves and depart the city unharmed. The fall of Jerusalem sent shockwaves throughout the Christian world. The hard-won gains of the First Crusade had been virtually wiped out in a matter of months. The Crusader states, once a formidable presence in the Levant, had been reduced to a handful of coastal enclaves. The dream of a Christian-ruled Holy Land seemed to be in ashes. But the Crusader spirit was not so easily extinguished. News of Jerusalem's fall galvanized Europe, setting in motion the chain of events that would lead to the Third Crusade. The continent's greatest monarchs, Richard the Lionheart of England, Philip Augustus of France, and Frederick Barbarossa of Germany, took up the cross, vowing to reclaim the Holy City from Saladin's grasp. For the people of the Levant, Muslim and Christian alike, it was the beginning of yet another tumultuous chapter in the long and bloody history of the Crusades. The coming years would see epic battles, daring feats of arms, and larger-than-life personalities, but also more suffering, destruction, and religious strife. The end of the 12th century marked not a conclusion, but rather a new and even more complex phase in the struggle for the Holy Land. As the 12th century drew to a close, the Third Crusade was in full swing. The great armies of Europe, led by some of the most famous warriors of the age, descended upon the Levant, determined to wrest Jerusalem back from Saladin's control. The stage was set for a titanic clash of arms and wills that would once again reshape the political and religious landscape of the Middle East. At the forefront of this new crusading effort was Richard the Lionheart, the legendary English king renowned for his martial prowess and his fiery temperament. Richard had taken up the cross with enthusiastic zeal, seeing the crusade as a chance to win glory for himself and salvation for his soul. He arrived in the Holy Land in 1191, having already captured the strategically vital island of Cyprus along the way. Richard's arrival energized the Crusader forces, who had been bogged down in a lengthy siege of the city of Acre. With the English king's leadership and the reinforcements he brought, the Crusaders finally succeeded in taking the city in July 1191, after nearly 2 years of bloody and attritional warfare. It was a much-needed victory for the Christian cause, providing a valuable foothold on the Mediterranean coast. But the taking of Acre also showcased the darker side of the Crusader mentality. After the city fell, Richard ordered the massacre of some 2,700 Muslim prisoners, including women and children. It was an act of shocking brutality, even by the harsh standards of the time, and it stood in stark contrast to Saladin's treatment of Jerusalem's Christian population just a few years earlier. The massacre at Acre was a stark reminder of the religious and cultural gulf that separated the Crusaders from the Muslim world they had invaded. For Richard and his fellow European nobles, the Muslims were not just military adversaries, but also religious infidels whose very existence was an affront to God. This uncompromising worldview would shape the course of the Third Crusade, making any lasting peace or accommodation between the two sides all but impossible. After the fall of Acre, Richard led the Crusader army southward along the coast with the ultimate goal of recapturing Jerusalem. But Saladin, still in control of the Holy City and much of the surrounding countryside, was not about to give up his hard-won gains without a fight. Over the next year, the two great warriors would engage in a cat-and-mouse game across the hills and valleys of the Levant, each trying to outmaneuver and outfight the other. For the local populations caught in the middle of this titanic struggle, life became a constant cycle of fear, uncertainty, and displacement. Villages and towns found themselves repeatedly occupied and reoccupied by the opposing armies, their inhabitants subjected to the whims and depredations of the soldiers. Fields and orchards were trampled and burned, livestock slaughtered or stolen, ancient irrigation systems wrecked and abandoned. The Third Crusade also took a heavy toll on the Crusaders themselves. Disease and hunger stalked the European armies, while the scorching heat of the Levantine summer sapped their strength and their morale. Many Crusaders, disillusioned by the harsh realities of the campaign and the elusive goal of Jerusalem, simply deserted and made their way back to the coast, hoping to find passage home. Despite these challenges, Richard pressed on, his force of will and his military genius keeping the Crusader cause alive. In September 1191, he won a stunning victory over Saladin at the Battle of Arsuf, employing innovative tactics and the disciplined valor of his knights to overcome the Muslims' numerical advantage. It was a much-needed boost to Crusader morale, and it opened the way for a possible march on Jerusalem. But as the Crusaders advanced inland, the logistical and political obstacles mounted. The European army, exhausted and depleted by months of campaigning, found itself dangerously overextended, its supply lines stretched thin. Meanwhile, tensions within the Crusader leadership, particularly between Richard and the French King Philip Augustus, threatened to tear the expedition apart from within. In the end, despite coming within sight of Jerusalem's walls, Richard made the difficult decision to turn back. He realized that even if he could take the city, he lacked the manpower and resources to hold it against Saladin's inevitable counterattack. It was a bitter pill for the crews. As the dust settled on the rubble of Constantinople, the Fourth Crusade limped to an inglorious end. The great city, once the shining jewel of Christendom, lay in ruins. Its palaces and churches looted, its people scattered or enslaved. The Crusaders had achieved the unthinkable, the unconscionable. They had turned their swords not against the Muslims, but against their fellow Christians. The Byzantine Empire, already weakened by centuries of war and decline, would never fully recover from this devastating blow. For the average person living in the 13th century, the shock and horror of the Fourth Crusade's outcome must have been difficult to comprehend. How could an army ostensibly raised to retake Jerusalem instead bring ruin to the greatest Christian city in the world? The political intrigues and cynical dealings that led to this catastrophe were far above the understanding of the common peasant or foot soldier. They could only marvel at the mysterious workings of popes and kings that could lead to such a disastrous outcome. In the grand halls of Venice and the scattered Crusader states, the self-serving men who had engineered this debacle worked quickly to take advantage of the new status quo. The wily Venetians, who had long resented Constantinople's dominance of trade in the eastern Mediterranean, greedily snatched up choice ports and islands for their own enrichment. The Crusader lords divided up much of the conquered Byzantine territories amongst themselves, establishing new feudal principalities in a parody of their original goal of Christian unity. But while the high and mighty congratulated themselves on their conquests, life for the common people only became harder in the wake of the Fourth Crusade. The shattered Byzantine Empire could no longer serve as a bulwark against Muslim expansion, allowing the Turks and other powers to steadily chip away at Christian lands. Trade networks were disrupted, leading to scarcity and inflation throughout the region. Most tragically, the destruction of Constantinople and the blow to Eastern Orthodox Christianity would deepen the divide between the Catholic West and the Orthodox East, a wound that endures to some extent even today. In the coming years, there would be several more attempts to recapture Jerusalem and shore up the failing Crusader states. The Fifth Crusade, launched in 1217, managed to briefly capture the Egyptian port city of Damietta, but a rash advance on Cairo led to the Crusaders being trapped and forced to surrender. The charismatic but arrogant Emperor Frederick II actually managed to negotiate the peaceful return of Jerusalem in 1229, but this was accomplished through diplomacy with the Muslims rather than force of arms. Frederick's success was short-lived, however, and Jerusalem fell once again to the Muslims in 1244. Other crusades, like the 6th and 7th, flickered out without achieving any significant gains. One of the most tragic and bizarre episodes of this era was the so-called Children's Crusade in 1212. According to chroniclers of the time, thousands of young peasants gathered in France and Germany, believing that their innocence and the hand of God would allow them to succeed where their elders had failed in reclaiming the Holy Land. Few, if any of them, made it to the Middle East. Most dispersed or were sold into slavery long before reaching their destination. While modern historians doubt some of the details around the Children's Crusade, it nevertheless stands as a disturbing symbol of the religious fervor and societal turmoil that gripped Europe in the 13th century. As the decades passed and the Crusader states continued to crumble, it became increasingly clear that the dream of a Christian-held Jerusalem was slipping away. The local Muslim powers, once divided and overpowered by the initial Crusader onslaught, slowly gained strength and unity. The Mamluk dynasty in Egypt proved especially formidable as the 13th century progressed. Hardened slave warriors purchased and trained from childhood, the Mamluks were a potent military force that would eventually extinguish the Crusader presence entirely. One figure who towers over the early years of the Mamluk ascendancy is Baybars, a ferocious and canny leader who rose from slavery to become Sultan of Egypt and Syria. A brilliant military tactician and ruthless politician, Baybars led the Mamluks to a string of victories against both Crusaders and their own Muslim rivals like the Mongols. His capture of Antioch in 1268 marked the irrevocable decline of Crusader power, paving the way for their eventual expulsion from the Levant. The final chapter in the bloody saga of the Crusades came in 1291 at the Siege of Acre, the last major stronghold of the Crusaders in the Holy Land. For weeks, the Mamluk forces under Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil bombarded the city's formidable defenses with siege engines. Despite desperate resistance from the Templars, Hospitallers, and other Crusader orders, the city's walls were eventually breached. As Acre fell, its inhabitants were put to the sword or sold into slavery in scenes of unimaginable brutality. A handful of Crusaders managed to escape by sea, but most were not so lucky. In the end, those who had given up everything to follow the cross to the Middle East found only an unmarked grave in the burning sands. And so, after 2 centuries of bloodshed, fanaticism, and unimaginable suffering, the dream of the Crusades finally died on the shores of Acre. The human cost is difficult to fathom: hundreds of thousands of soldiers, civilians and innocents killed, and an entire region left permanently scarred and embittered. While the Crusades had begun with the noble goal of freeing the Holy Land from Muslim rule, they ended in a morass of greed, cruelty, and deception that perverted those original aims beyond all recognition. For the generations that survived and followed the Crusades, the psychological and spiritual toll of this calamitous era must have been immense. How could one reconcile the promise of heavenly glory with the unspeakable atrocities committed by crusaders in the very lands where Christ had preached peace and compassion? How could the seemingly invincible power of the Roman Catholic Church be squared with the repeated failures of popes and kings to make good on their grand promises to reclaim Jerusalem? For the medieval mind, steeped in an unquestioning faith in the righteousness of the Crusades, this shattering of illusions must have been deeply traumatic. And yet, even as the Crusader states crumbled into dust, their legacy would endure in ways that continue to reverberate through history. The Crusades marked a critical turning point in the relationship between the Christian West and the Muslim East, feeding a cycle of mistrust, hostility, and misunderstanding that persists to some degree even today. At the same time, exposure to the flourishing civilizations of the Middle East during the Crusades had a profound impact on European culture, science, and technology. The Crusader era also saw the rise of powerful new institutions like the military orders and the Italian merchant republics, which would go on to shape the course of European history in significant ways. But perhaps the most important legacy of the Crusades is the enduring power of the very idea, the notion that violence and warfare can be sanctified in the name of religion, and that worldly suffering is a small price to pay for eternal glory. This potent cocktail of faith and force would resurface again and again in the centuries to come, fueling the conquests of the Americas, the savagery of the religious wars that racked Europe, and the colonial excesses of the 19th and 20th centuries. In many ways, we are still grappling with the ideological fallout of the Crusades, still struggling to untangle the twisted threads of holy war and righteous conquest that were first spun in the fevered sermons of Pope Urban II nearly a millennium ago. As we reflect on this turbulent and tragic chapter in human history, it is hard not to be overcome by a deep sense of sorrow and regret. So many lives lost, so much potential squandered, so much suffering inflicted in the name of God and glory. If there is any lesson to be drawn from the Crusades, perhaps it is the danger of unchecked fanaticism, of allowing our highest ideals to be corrupted by our basest impulses. In a world still riven by religious strife and sectarian violence, this is a warning that remains as urgently relevant as ever. But let us also remember the glimmers of humanity and heroism that managed to shine through even in the darkest days of the Crusades. The courage of the foot soldiers who marched into the unknown for the sake of their faith. The resilience of the civilians who endured unimaginable hardships. The flashes of chivalry and mercy that sometimes transcended the brutality of the battlefield. These moments, however fleeting, remind us of the incredible capacity of the human spirit to endure and to hope, even in the face of the most terrible adversity. And so we come to the end of our journey through the blood-soaked annals of the Crusades, a chapter of history as dark and dreadful as it is strangely compelling. From the first stirrings of religious zeal in Clermont to the final gasping collapse of Acre, we have borne witness to the heights and depths of human nature, to the noble ideals and horrific realities that shaped an era. It is a story that continues to fascinate and appall us in equal measure, a tale of faith and folly, of courage and cruelty, of the very best and worst of what humanity is capable of. As you drift off to sleep, Ponder the strange twists of fate and fortune that led so many to risk and lose everything in pursuit of a distant dream in a faraway land. Imagine the lives of the nameless multitudes who toiled and suffered under the banner of the cross, the kings and commoners, saints and sinners, caught up in the great tides of history. And marvel at the enduring power of an idea, a story, a myth, for in many ways, that is what the Crusades have become, a legend etched in blood and stone, a cautionary fable whispered down through the ages. Sleep now, and dream of a world where the hard-won lessons of the Crusades have at last been learned, where faith is a source of unity rather than division, and where the courage of conviction is tempered by the wisdom of compassion. For if there is any redemption to be found in this harrowing tale, it is in the hope that we may yet find a way to honor the sacrifices of the past, while building a future free from the cycle of holy war and retribution that has haunted us for so long. In that dream, perhaps, the weary souls of the Crusades may at last find the peace and rest that eluded them in life. The Mamluks were a new breed of warrior, honed by years of intense training and indoctrination from childhood. Originally slave soldiers from the Eurasian steppe, they rose to become the ruling class in Egypt, known for their skill as cavalrymen and their fanatical devotion to Islam. Under the leadership of Sultan Baybars in the late 13th century, the Mamluks emerged as a formidable power in the region. Baybars was a brilliant military strategist who had a keen understanding of the Crusaders' weaknesses. He knew that the Crusader states were overextended, their forces depleted by years of constant warfare. Baybars wasted no time in exploiting this vulnerability. In 1268, Baybars captured the strategic city of Antioch from the Crusaders, a devastating blow that sent shockwaves through the Christian world. The fall of Antioch, once a bastion of Crusader power, was a grim harbinger of what was to come for the remaining Crusader strongholds along the coast. The Mamluk war machine was relentless. Baybars and his successors systematically attacked Crusader castles and cities, using advanced siege engines and psychological warfare to wear down their defenses. The Mamluks were masters of mounted archery, able to loose volleys of arrows with pinpoint accuracy while at full gallop. Imagine the terror of Crusader foot soldiers as a thundering cavalry charge bore down on their positions, the sky darkening with arrows. Despite desperate pleas for reinforcements from Europe, help was not forthcoming for the beleaguered Crusaders. The heyday of the Grand Crusades was over. The enthusiasm and religious fervor that had sustained the earlier campaigns had long since cooled. The rulers of Europe were preoccupied with their own internal conflicts and dynastic struggles, unable or unwilling to mount a serious effort to defend the Holy Land. And so the Crusader states crumbled under the Mamluk onslaught, their defenses overrun, their cities put to the sword. A Venetian pilgrim who visited the ruins of Acre a few years after its fall in 1291 wrote, "The walls were razed, the churches were destroyed, the houses were burnt, the people were killed. Indeed, there was not one stone left upon another which was not thrown down. I could scarcely restrain my tears. Indeed, I wept bitterly, as did all the Christians who were with me, and we sadly discussed how so mighty a city, so well fortified, so well supplied with arms, provisions, people, could suddenly be destroyed in this way." It was a somber end to nearly 2 centuries of Crusader presence in the Levant. The grand castles and cathedrals they had built now lay in ruins, monuments to the ultimate futility of their enterprise. Countless lives had been lost, unimaginable resources squandered, in a conflict that had begun with such promise, but ended in bitter defeat. The fall of Acre marked the twilight of the Crusader era, but its complex legacy would endure long after the last Latin banners disappeared over the horizon. The Crusades left an indelible mark on the medieval world, shaping everything from art and architecture to politics and trade. They brought the peoples of Europe into direct contact with the sophisticated civilizations of the Near East, sparking a cultural exchange that would help pave the way for the Renaissance. But the Crusades also left a troubled legacy of religious fanaticism, xenophobia, and distrust between Christians and Muslims that sadly still echoes through to our own time. The scars of this bitter conflict continue to shape the geopolitical realities of the modern Middle East, a sobering reminder of the long shadow of history. As we reflect on the Crusades from the distance of centuries, it's hard not to be struck by the sheer misery and suffering they inflicted on people from all walks of life. Whether you were a knight shivering in a drafty castle tower, a Mamluk warrior far from the windswept steppes of your homeland, or a simple peasant caught in the crossfire of holy war, life during the Crusades was often nasty, brutish, and short. And yet, even amidst the bloodshed and hardship, there are glimmers of our shared humanity, tales of chivalry and honor, of cultural exchange and grudging respect between enemies, of simple acts of kindness in the face of cruelty. These moments remind us that even in the darkest chapters of our history, the human spirit endures, unbroken and unbowed. Perhaps the ultimate legacy of the Crusades is one of hard-learned wisdom, a cautionary tale about the perils of religious extremism, the futility of holy war, and the need for greater understanding and tolerance between peoples of different faiths and cultures. It's a lesson that feels more urgent than ever in our fractured and turbulent world. So as we close the book on this bloody and momentous chapter of history, let us reflect on the hard truths it imparts. May we strive to build bridges instead of walls, to seek common ground instead of battlegrounds, and may we never forget the ordinary men and women on all sides who bore the brunt of the Crusades' fury, their struggles, their sacrifices, their simple dreams of a life free from the spectre of war. As the Crusader era came to a close with the fall of Acre in 1291, the medieval world found itself forever changed by the centuries of conflict that had engulfed the Holy Land. The Crusades left an indelible mark on the fabric of history, shaping the course of empires, religions, and societies for generations to come. The legacy of the Crusades is a complex and often controversial one. On one hand, they represented an unprecedented mobilization of people and resources, driven by a fervent religious zeal and a desire to reclaim the holy sites of Christianity. The Crusaders themselves were a diverse group, hailing from all corners of Europe and representing a wide range of social classes and backgrounds. Many were motivated by a genuine belief in the righteousness of their cause, while others saw the Crusades as an opportunity for adventure, glory, or financial gain. Yet the Crusades also left a dark stain on the annals of history. The violence and brutality inflicted upon Muslim and Jewish populations in the Holy Land was shocking, even by the standards of the time. The sacking of Jerusalem during the First Crusade, for example, saw thousands of civilians massacred in the streets, their blood flowing through the holy city like a river. Similar atrocities were committed in other conquered cities, leaving a legacy of bitterness and mistrust that would endure for centuries. The Crusades also had far-reaching consequences for the balance of power in the medieval world. The Byzantine Empire, once a bulwark of Christianity in the East, was left severely weakened by the Fourth Crusade's sack of Constantinople in 1204. This paved the way for the empire's eventual decline and fall, and for the rise of the Ottoman Turks, who would go on to conquer much of the Middle East and Eastern Europe. In the West, the Crusades helped to solidify the power of the Catholic Church and the papacy. The popes played a central role in organizing and promoting the Crusades, and their authority was greatly enhanced as a result. The Crusades also had a profound impact on European society and culture, introducing new ideas, technologies, and goods from the East. The tales of chivalry and heroism that emerged from the Crusades would go on to shape the romantic ideals of knighthood and nobility for generations to come. Yet for all their impact on the medieval world, the Crusades ultimately failed in their central objective of reclaiming the Holy Land for Christianity. Despite the bravery and sacrifice of countless crusaders, the Muslim powers of the Middle East proved too strong to overcome. The fall of Acre in 1291 marked the end of the Crusader presence in the Levant, and the dream of a Christian-ruled Jerusalem would remain unfulfilled. In the centuries that followed, the Crusades would continue to cast a long shadow over the relations between the Christian and Muslim worlds. The legacy of mistrust and hostility that they engendered would fuel conflicts and misunderstandings that persist to this day. Yet the Crusades also serve as a reminder of the complex web of religious, political, and cultural forces that have shaped the course of history, and of the enduring power of faith and ideology to motivate and inspire people to great heights of courage and sacrifice. As we reflect on the Crusades and their place in history, it is perhaps fitting to end with a quote from the great Muslim leader Saladin, who fought against the Crusaders and ultimately recaptured Jerusalem in 1187. When asked by a Crusader prisoner why he fought with such determination, Saladin is said to have replied, "I warn you against shedding blood, indulging in it, and making a habit of it, for blood never sleeps." It is a poignant reminder of the heavy toll that the Crusades exacted on all sides, and of the enduring legacy of violence and conflict that they left behind. Yet, it is also a call to seek understanding and reconciliation, to learn from the mistakes of the past, and to strive for a future of greater peace and harmony between all peoples. And so, as we bring our journey through the Crusades to a close, I invite you to reflect on the lessons of this turbulent and fascinating period of history, to ponder the courage and conviction of those who fought and died on both sides of the conflict, and to consider the complex tapestry of faith, politics, and culture that shaped their world and ours. If you've enjoyed this foray into the medieval world and the Crusades, I encourage you to like this video and subscribe to the channel for more immersive and educational journeys through history. There are countless more stories waiting to be told, each one a window into the triumphs and tragedies, the heroes and villains that have shaped the course of human civilization. But for now, let us take a moment to appreciate the power of history to illuminate and inform our present, to marvel at the resilience and ingenuity of the human spirit, even in the face of great adversity and suffering, and to renew our commitment to building a world of greater understanding, compassion, and peace. Thank you for joining me on this journey through the Crusades. May your dreams be filled with the wisdom of the past and the hope for a brighter future. Good night.